This is Kathy from Gadgets Top 321, and in today's video, I'm going to be taking a look at DeAtramentis Elderberries. I'll be doing a writing sample on 52 GSM Tomoe River paper using a variety of pens and nib sizes ranging from a Pilot Extra Fine to a 1.5 stub nib. I'll take a look at writing samples that I did on other types of paper. I'll compare DeAtramentis Elderberries to various other similar inks in my collection. And finally, I'll take a look at the results of my water resistance test. DeAtramentis Elderberries came off the nib of my glass dip pen, fairly wet at first, but then settled into a nice uniform line. The swatch that I made with tweezers was nice and crisp on this Tomoe River paper, but on some of the other papers, I had a little bit of trouble of the ink not wanting to hold on to the paper. The drip at the end of the swatch has a dark halo, but I'm not seeing any sheen. I'm going to begin with my Pilot Kakuno. It has an extra fine stainless steel nib. I really like this ink in this extra fine nib, especially on these really smooth papers like Tomoe River and the Tsubame paper that is used for my ink collection cards, and even the paper that is used in my Jibun Techo. This Pilot Extra Fine puts down a very fine line, but it's still very legible, and the nib feels very pleasant on the paper. I'm reluctant to call it smooth because I know people who aren't used to extra fine nibs probably wouldn't find this smooth, but relative to other fine nibs, this is nice and smooth. Next, I'll be writing with my Sailor Pro Gear Slim. It has a 14 karat fine nib. It's marked hard fine on the side of the nib. This is the only 14 karat Sailor fine nib that I own, so I don't have anything to compare it to. I really like writing with this nib on the smooth papers that I mentioned before, but I also use rhodia paper a lot, and I'm just not fond of this nib on rhodia paper. I believe it's just the shape of the tipping. It tends to pick up paper fibers. It doesn't really, I wouldn't say that it necessarily feels scratchy. It feels feedbacky like you hear people mentioning with Sailor nibs, but on rhodia paper and papers of that with that type of feel to them, this nib does tend to pick up paper fibers. But like I said, on this smooth paper, it's very nice. It looks fairly wet, but the line that it's putting down doesn't really feel wet. It feels nice. Next, I've got a Platinum 3776. It has a 14 karat medium nib. Throughout all the writing samples that I did, I loved this ink and this pen. I'm on a kick right now of magenta and burgundy inks and black pens. I just think it's really classy looking, and I really enjoy the feel of this ink in this pen. It's got just a nice tactile feedback, and I can hear the scratchy sound on the paper, and you can see how much more the ink pops coming out of this nib versus the two finer nibs. This isn't smooth, but it is very nice. Next, I'll be writing with the Kaweco AL Sport in the Golden Espresso edition. It has a stainless steel medium nib. I have every size of the Kaweco nibs except for the stub nibs. And I went back and watched a video that I did comparing the different nib sizes, and I saw that this medium nib was one of the drier nibs out of all of them. But with this ink on this type of paper, it just works really well. I like it. Now, on some of the other writing samples that I did, it was a little too dry for my taste, but for this paper, it is very nice, and this is very smooth. I would call this buttery smooth. It's not so glassy smooth you feel like you're going to slide off the page. It's just a very pleasant smoothness. Next, I'll be writing with my Pilot Metropolitan. It has a stainless steel CM nib. All right, I'm pleasantly surprised. This was nice and smooth on this paper. This nib has been kind of hit and miss on my writing samples. It looks nice and wet here, but on some of the writing samples I did, it felt a little dry. But on this paper, this is nice and smooth. And again, it feels kind of like the Kaweco medium. It's a buttery smoothness. It doesn't feel like you're going to slip and slide off the paper. Next, I've got a Kaweco Lilliput. It has a stainless steel broad nib. This nib is very pleasant to write with this ink. I see some subtle shading, and again, it just feels nice and smooth, but not so smooth that it's unpleasant. And I can hear the nib on the paper. Very nice. And finally, I've got my Jinhao X750. It has a 1.5 stainless steel stub nib. This ink feels very luxurious in this nib on this paper. While that dries, I'll take a look at some of the other writing samples. On the Rhodia paper, you can see in the swatch that we may get some subtle shading. There's not a huge difference between the dark end and the light end. I didn't have any trouble with the swatch wanting to grab the paper, but I did have a little trouble with the wider stub nib here at the beginning. But then after it started writing, I didn't have any more trouble. The Kaweco broad nib was nice, and the reverse writing was also very nice. The Metropolitan felt dry on this paper, and that's a shame because this is one of my primary note-taking papers, and it required me to put just the slightest bit of extra pressure on the paper, which made it a little more uncomfortable for longer writing sessions and would just lead to more hand fatigue. So I wasn't as impressed with the Metropolitan. The Kaweco also felt a little too dry, but for the same thing. For shorter, just little bits of writing, you probably wouldn't even notice it, but for longer writing, it would probably become more irritating. The 3776 was very nice. I really, again, like this nib with this ink. The Pro Gear Slim just was a little too dry for this paper. And like I said, the nib just wants to pick up paper fibers when I use it on this Rhodia paper. The Kakuno, I was tempted to call it smooth, but I changed my mind and said I probably should just call it nice, and it was very nice on this paper. On copy paper, this was a fairly well-performing ink. It spread a little bit. I wouldn't call it necessarily feathering. You can see that the letters are a little ragged, but not too bad. The Kaweco did really nice. The reverse writing was very nice. The Pilot Metropolitan. This paper is where the two pens that did poorly on the other papers really kind of shined. So those drier writing pens do much better on the copy paper. Now the finer nibs I wasn't as fond of. They were scratchy and felt dry. In my old Leuchtturm bullet journal, these inks that have a tendency to have a dark halo really shine on this paper. Now, I don't know, my lighting at this time of the day doesn't really showcase it that well, but I really liked this ink on this paper. I have a feeling in my broad Kaweco nib, this would be really nice. I guess DeAtramentis Elderberries falls into the burgundy color family, but before I get to my burgundy inks, I want to compare it to DeAtramentis Aubergine. I was really fond of this ink when I tried it, but I think I like burgundy inks more than purple inks. Just something about this color I'm very fond of, and I feel like these two inks perform very similarly. Now it looks very similar to Writer's Blood, but I feel like this has maybe a little more of a magenta to it, a little more pink to it, but they do look very similar. Rouge Granat is a little more red. I would call it my favorite red ink. Now, everybody is always talking about Noodler's Black Swan in Australian roses, but English roses has always been my favorite of those two inks, and it is similar to elderberries, but English roses is a little more red. I feel like elderberries is maybe in between English and Australian roses. Australian roses is a little more magenta. I enjoyed Noodler's Black Red when I tried it, and it's similar to this ink, but more red. You see more of the magenta when you compare the two. It's very similar to Sailor Mano Kuzu, but it looks like Kuzu has a wider range between the darker and the lighter shade. So I think you would see more shading. And let me see. Did Kuzu? Yeah, Kuzu has a little halo of sheen, where Elderberries does not. Tasha Ebby is also very similar in color, but I'm seeing less of the dark. It has little splotches of dark, like where you have the little drips of heavy ink, where Elderberries tends to shade a little more uniformly, more subtle shading, but very similar in color. DeAtramentis Elderberries has a water-resistant component. When I submerged this writing sample that I did on Rhodia paper into water for 10 minutes, the burgundy color all lifted off the paper, and I was left with a very clean, either black or gray on the paper, and it's very crisp and very legible. I love this type of water resistance. Okay, on the Tomoe River paper, no bleed through, even in the heaviest spots. Maybe did get kind of deep into the paper on that drip, but it's a darker ink, so you do have some show through. The water resistance of this ink and how well it performs in the Platinum 3776 makes this a go-to ink for me for that particular pen. On poor quality paper, I'm really liking this in the Pilot Metropolitan. I feel like in a Pilot medium nib, those stainless steel medium nibs, it would do very well. And I also really liked it in the Kaweco broad nib. I like using my Kaweco broad nib for letter writing. I've got a bunch of ink samples in a rack up here on my desk that I'm going through, and this one was close to coming up next in the list, but someone suggested it, and then I saw Chris Sines using this ink in one of her currently inked videos, and her ink tile that she does showed that it had the type of water resistance that I really enjoy in an ink, so I bumped it up to the head of the line, and I'm glad I did. This is a really nice ink. It's fall right now. I feel like this time of year, this is a nice color to use. It reminds me of maple leaves, and like I said, I really like this ink in the way it looks in my black pens, and even in this brown Kaweco. It has a real nice fall vibe to it. I feel like this is an ink that feel you can feel the nib on paper. If your nib has any imperfections, you'll feel that, kind of like with my Sailor Pro Gear Slim. I need to check that nib since it is picking up paper fibers on some papers like my Rhodia paper. I need to check that out. There might be some slight misalignment, or maybe I just need to smooth it a little. But even like on my Kaweco broad nib that is, a very smooth nib, I could just barely feel the nib on paper in a pleasant way. It's very nice. All right, if you found this video helpful, please give me a thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel.